dive, everyone. And today is a bit of a bittersweet one. June 21st marks 15 years since we lost the one and only Frank Sidebottom.
15 years, yeah. It's amazing how even after all this time, Frank Sidebottom is still remembered.
Absolutely. And for anyone just joining us, Frank Sidebottom was this incredible comedian and musician with his papier-mâché head and a kind of off-key approach to pop music.
Right.
For this deep dive, we've got a whole bunch of articles and web pages you've pulled together exploring Frank's career, the man behind it all, Chris Sievey, and the impact he had on so many people.
Yeah, Frank was more than just a comedian, though, wasn't he? He was a musician, an artist, even a cartoonist, and a stop-motion animator later on.
He was like DIY creativity in human form, which is probably why he's still so relevant even today.
There.
So let's rewind a bit before we go full-on papier-mâché. Chris Sievey, the man who created Frank, had a pretty interesting life himself, didn't he? Starting really young.
Yeah, really young. He was passionate about music from the start. Like by 14, he was already writing and recording music. And by 15, he was playing gigs with local bands.
Wow.
There's even this story about him trying to meet the Beatles when he was 16.
At Apple Records.
Yeah, at Apple Records HQ. Imagine that.
Talk about aiming high.
I know.
That's some serious ambition there. And even before Chris Sievey was releasing his own music, right? He had a band, the Freshies. They actually made it into the UK charts.
They did, yeah. They got to number 54 with I'm in Love with the Girl on the Manchester Virgin Megastore checkout desk.
What a title.
Amazing.
You can almost see Frank Sidebottom starting to form right there in those early years, can't you? The desire to be a pop star. The quirky humor.
It's like Frank was almost a reflection of Chris Sievey's own journey trying to make it in the music world.
So how did this whole Frank Sidebottom thing even happen?
Okay, so picture this. It's 1984, and this character just appears out of nowhere with this huge papier-mâché head. Later, he changed it to fiberglass, but at first it was papier-mâché and wearing a suit from the 1950s.
A 50s suit.
And that was it. Frank Sidebottom was born. And even with that crazy look, he was a hit.
Yeah, it was.
The head was handmade, a little bit rough around the edges.
It was.
And that made him even more lovable, you know?
You just couldn't ignore him, could you?
You couldn't.
It's so true. Frank wasn't like all polished and slick like so many other performers at the time. He was quirky, this totally DIY creation, and that's what made him so endearing. And his character was just as unique as that, eternally optimistic, a little bit clueless, aspiring pop star from Timberlake.
Oh, yeah. Always with a fantastic, or bobbins.
Exactly. And
ready to go.
And it wasn't just music and comedy. He became this personality on regional TV in the Northwest.
Yeah.
Local shows, even being a reporter on Granada Reports. Imagine Frank Sidebottom delivering the news.
Oh, that would have been brilliant.
And on top of all that, he was working with some pretty big names, wasn't he? Mark and Lard Carolina Hearn, even before she became Mrs. Merton.
Oh, yeah.
John Ronson played keyboards in his band. It's crazy to think all these talented people were drawn to Frank's world.
He was like a magnet for creative people. And it wasn't just a quick thing either. He went on to make his own TV shows, Frank Sidebottom's Fantastic Shed Show and Frank Sidebottom's Proper Telly Show on BW, always coming up with new things.
And he even contributed to Bob the Builder and Pingu with stop-motion animation.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable, the range. He had this well of creativity all flowing from this character he built. So inspiring.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of those creative things he did, starting with his music career.
Okay, yeah, let's do it. Frank's music was just as unique as his look. Catchy pop melodies, a lot of covers of famous songs, but with this kind of off-key charm.
Yeah.
It was like he was making fun of pop music, but also loving it at the same time.
He wasn't afraid to be a bit rough around the edges, was he? It made it more real, more human. And it's amazing to think that he never had a big hit song when he was alive, but after he died, people tried to get Guess Who's Been on Match of the Day into the charts.
Yeah, and they did it. It got to number 66, which shows how much people loved him. I was actually reading a blog post by someone who worked with Chris Sievey, and they said that sometimes, even late at night, driving home from a show, Chris would just stay in character as Frank.
Wow.
It wasn't just a performance for him. It was like his whole life.
That's real dedication.
Yeah.
But do you think it ever got to be too much for Chris Sievey? I mean, having this huge persona always there?
There's a good question. I think maybe sometimes it was, especially later on, it seems like the lines between Chris Sievey and Frank Sidebottom got blurry.
Yeah.
Frank was his way to be creative, but he also kind of overshadowed some of Chris's other work.
Like with Carolina Hearn, who went on to create Mrs. Merton, she started in Frank's world.
Right.
And that must have been strange for Chris Sievey to see a character he helped make become so famous while Frank was more of a cult figure.
Yeah, it's a weird situation, isn't it? And we don't really know how he felt, but at least from the outside, Chris Sievey never seemed bitter or anything. He just kept pushing the limits of what Frank Sidebottom could be.
He never gave up on the character, which is amazing, really.
Hmm.
He believed in Frank and his ability to make people happy, even when it wasn't easy. Speaking of creativity, though we haven't even talked about his art.
Oh, yeah, you mean the exhibition they had of his drawings and animations and stuff at the Chelsea Space Gallery in London back in 2007?
I know, isn't that wild?
Yeah.
Frank Sidebottom's art in a fancy gallery.
I know, right?
It really shows how deep and complex his artistic vision was.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't just this goofy character with a papier-mâché head. There was real talent there, often missed because of the humor.
Absolutely. And don't forget about his video games he made early on, in the early 80s when home computers were just starting to be a thing. He was already making games like Flying Train and The Biz.
That's amazing. He was creating this whole comedic persona and also messing around with technology. What a pioneer.
Yeah, he was always experimenting, trying new things while still staying true to that Frank Sidebottom character. It's something we can all learn from, Don't be afraid to try new things. Push yourself, but always be yourself.
He was saying, it's okay to be different. Embrace your quirks. Let your inner Dobbins out. And that message is so important these days when everyone feels pressure to be the same. But let's get back to the sources you mentioned, Oi&K magazine earlier. Tell me more about what Frank did there.
Oh, yeah. Oi&K was this great kids comic in the UK, super funny and a little bit rebellious. And Frank's comics were perfect for it. Celebrity gossip, weird DIY projects, even a cutout zoetrope, all in Frank's unique style. He was a whirlwind of creativity on every page.
That sounds brilliant. I would have loved that as a kid. I always assumed he just whipped those comics together, though, with his whole DIY thing.
Oh, no, you'd be wrong there. Wow. Apparently, Chris Sievey was really careful even with the Frank Sidebottom stuff. There's a story about him spending hours stippling with a felt-tip pen to make textures in his artwork.
Really? Wow, I never would have guessed that level of detail is incredible. He didn't treat his work for kids any differently than something you'd do for a gallery.
Exactly. He respected his audience no matter who they were. And he put his heart into everything he made. And I think that's why people connected with Frank Sidebottom so deeply. It wasn't just an act. It was a whole world he built with real passion and creativity.
And you can see that in everything he did, the music, the TV shows, even those strange comics, listening to all this. It really hits me how ahead of his time Chris Sievey was. The internet wasn't even really a thing when Frank Sidebottom was at his peak. But he was already doing things that would have been perfect for the digital age.
Oh, totally. Imagine Frank with a YouTube channel or on Twitter or even doing TikToks.
Could you imagine?
He would have been so huge online. The memes would have been legendary.
He totally would. He was like a master of promoting himself and creating content. Before those were even things, he sent out a press release introducing himself as Frank Sidebottom.
I'm thinking of getting into showbiz. You have any pamphlets? It's hilarious.
And it worked. He even got signed to a record label, all while keeping his real identity secret. It's amazing he managed to do that for so long. Everyone in the music industry must have known it was Chris Sievey, but they played along. It's like they were all part of the joke.
It really shows how charming Chris Sievey was and how infectious the Frank Sidebottom persona was. He made this world that people wanted to be a part of, a world of silly humor and endless possibilities.
It's like stepping into a cartoon, but a cartoon that's funny and sweet at the same time. No wonder people still love him so much 15 years later.
You're right. Frank wasn't just a character. He was a feeling and attitude. He reminded people not to take themselves too seriously, to find the joy in the crazy parts of life.
And in a world that feels so serious and stressful these days, that's a really important message.
It is. But speaking of the man behind the mask, we've talked a lot about Frank, but what about Chris Sievey? Who is the person behind that giant grin?
It's interesting you say that because everything I've read about Chris Sievey, he just seems so driven, so creative, like almost obsessed with creating.
Yeah, that's definitely the impression you get. It's like from when he was a kid, he was always making things, writing, drawing, building, never stopping, and that energy never went away, even when things were tough in his career. He just kept going, always with new ideas, new projects.
A real force of nature, creatively. A constant flow of ideas, all going into this one amazing character. It makes you wonder, did he ever take a break?
It doesn't seem like he did. And I think that leads to something important, the whole connection between Chris Sievey and Frank Sidebottom. Yeah, in those later years, it feels like they kind of became one.
Right.
He put so much of himself into Frank, it must have been hard to separate them.
I can only imagine and think about his personal life, too, trying to have a normal conversation with someone who's always in character with a giant papier-mâché head on.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah.
There's actually a scene in the Being Frank documentary where Chris Sievey is at his daughter's birthday party and he's trying to talk to her while wearing the Frank head.
Oh, wow.
And you can see she's uncomfortable. And in his eyes, there's this look of sadness almost.
Mm.
It's really sad to see.
It shows that even for someone as dedicated as Chris Sievey, finding that balance between your art and your life is hard. But even with those struggles, he never gave up on Frank.
No, he didn't. Frank Sidebottom was more than a character for Chris Sievey. It was his way of life, his philosophy, his own weird and optimistic view of the world.
And that's what still connects with people today. 15 years later, Frank reminds us that it's okay to be different, to be silly, to embrace the absurd. And in a world that can be so serious and overwhelming, sometimes that's a powerful message.
It is, and it's not just about being silly, is it? Frank, with all that craziness, was also really heartwarming. There was a real kindness and warmth there that you don't always find, especially in comedy.
It's that mix of humor and heart that makes him so timeless. And it's amazing how, even after Chris Sievey died, Frank's legacy kept growing. The campaign to get Guess Who's Been on Match of the Day into the charts, the statue they put up in Timperley, it's like Frank became something bigger than himself.
He really did. It shows you the power of creating, making something that lives on even after you're gone.
A beautiful legacy to leave behind.
It is, and I think it's one that Chris Sievey, with all the ups and downs, would have been proud of.
After all this, I'm feeling inspired to embrace my own inner Bobbins, to create something unique and wonderful. What about you?
Me too. Frank Sidebottom reminds us that life's too short to be anything but yourself, even if that means wearing a giant papier-mâché head and singing off-key pop songs.
Well said. I
Yeah.
think Frank would approve.
He would. It's been fantastic talking about Frank with you today.
Absolutely. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Frank Sidebottom. Remember, be fantastic, don't be Bobbins, and keep the spirit of Frank alive.